So I am Vidushi Mewari Margavati Bai. I am a Laurel from Meridies, and normally, so I do both Indian research finding, but lately my research has been primarily in dance and kind of court dance. I've studied both Kathak and Odissi, sort of both at a time. So I'm trying to piece together kind of what dance looked like in both places, and primarily Rajasthan and period, but Rajasthan is really difficult to research as far as dance goes. So Odissi is the thing because it's a little easier. And so what I'm gonna do, oh, and this is being recorded, everybody, just so you know. I think we, in the chat, that's also there, but yeah, it's being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, don't talk or show your camera. Yeah, okay. So today I'm going to try this. So this is a really difficult subject to talk about in reference to courtesans and period, because there isn't a lot of first, like, primary source evidence for courtesans as they existed in Indian courts. And it's possible, I just don't know that it's out there. We're finding new stuff all the time, and there's sort of some hints at similar, I think, references to courtesans, court performers, and sex workers, his like medieval Indian courts, but they're kind of hazy. So I'm basically going to talk about, that really briefly. I'm going to talk about what dance looks like in India, and then I'm going to talk about just give you some basic vocabulary for how you might understand storytelling in Indian dance, because that was a primary mode of communication in dance. There's a Natya Shastra, which is a document that was created in I think the 4th century, that basically outlines dance and theatrical performance and gives us essentially a manual for how you what music should do. So it's a relatively comprehensive historical manual on this sort of thing.
Okay, I've unmuted. Yeah, Margavati is completely frozen.
Yeah, I see that she is frozen.
I messaged her on Facebook, see if she'd stop. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Am I back in now?
You're back in.
Sorry, maybe I dropped out really quick. That was weird. Where did I freeze up at? Like, where did I lose you guys?
You were giving a rundown of what you were going to do in the class.
Shoot. Okay, so yeah, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get into it. You guys know what I'm gonna do as I go through it, because I've lost a little bit of time. I'm just gonna give you a little historical overview, and then I'm gonna give you an overview of how to interpret the motions and storytelling in the dance form. What I will say is that I've read a couple of things recently that have changed my view of how this dance works. Primarily, so since this is the courtesans track, I think it's important to talk about how these dancers would have functioned in a court setting. And from what I can tell, even though you had some dancers who were, like, there are Devadasis, and Devadasis were dancers who were dedicated to a particular god in a temple. And occasionally those women would have been sex workers as well, although the way that that sex work and temples functioned was very different from I don't know, it was tied to sort of a ritual practice. So it's not the way we think of courtesans in like Italy or Europe, and as these sort of independent, very educated, very, I think, cosmopolitan women. It was a very different function. And from what I can find out in Mughal controlled India, which is the northwest of India, women in courts were either dancers and musicians and might have been, you know, sort of in a courtesan level, or they were basically the spoils of war. And so there was a very different relationship between women who we traditionally think of as courtesans and the courts. It is hard to find any really hard documentation on this stuff, which, like I said, is not that it doesn't exist, it's just hard to find. I've been discussing this with a bunch of other researchers in the area, and it's just tough to figure out real documentation on this stuff. So what I'm going to talk about is what I know about dance in both Orissa, which is East India, and Rajasthan, which is West. And there are two dance forms. You have Odissi and you have Kathak. And so we're going to discuss those today. But first, I'm going to share a presentation for you. Share this. Can everybody see this? We're good?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. All right, so this is sort of, basically what I'm going to show you now are representations of dancers in temples. And from what I can tell, as far as documented dance forms go, Odissi is probably the oldest, because depictions of dancers show up in temples in Orissa from like the 2nd century BC. It's from Konark, which is the Sun Temple in Orissa, which is, like I said, it's way on the east side of India near Bengal. So this is some depictions of dancers in poses that you see in modern dance forms today, both in Bharatanatyam and Odissi. Primarily, I think this one here on the far right is really typical. The straight up and down pose with your hand up, showing that you're putting a tilak on, like a mark, and holding a mirror is something that you see a lot in dance today. So I really like studying dance in India because I feel the way that people are reconstructing dance forms in modern India mirrors what we do in the SCA a lot, because there was a break in tradition because of the British occupation during the imperial period. So these are some other dancers. You can see these two. I don't remember exactly where these are from. I believe they're South Indian. This one on the far right is a Chola bronze. It's from the Chola kingdoms in the south from about the 8th century. This one is Lord Shiva. He's often called the Nataraj, which is sort of the Lord of dance, and it is depicting him in the cosmic dance, which is the cycle of creation and destruction that he is basically what Shiva represents. And then here are some later period ones. These are specifically from Rajasthan, and the really interesting thing about these is this woman on the left is in a pose in a painting that is very similar to what you see in other dancers in sculptures. So these dancers are from Ranakpur Temple in Rajasthan from about the 15th century. They are Jain, which is not a Hindu. I mean, it's within the kind of Brahmanic kind of pantheon of religions. So Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, those are all in that group, but they're distinct from Hinduism, which is where most of the dance dramas that you see performed, it's where they have their basis. But you can see that these dancers are very similar in form to these dancers here who are from a Hindu temple. The Jain dancers look very similar. So the dance form in Rajasthan, hypothetically, I have a feeling that, you know, you can use the Natya Shastra to recreate dancing in both senses because the forms are taken from the same source, so you can kind of extrapolate from there. Now, there's some allegory happening in here because this is a religious depiction. Not entirely sure how much of it is allegory, but we can make some reasonable assumptions. But again, I like these two because you have a Rajasthani sculpture and then a Rajasthani painting, And there is some continuity between the two depictions from roughly the same time periods, maybe 100 years apart. These are also exclusively Rajasthani. You can see these are also dancers in forms that you see in modern Odissi and Bharatanatyam and Kathak sometimes, but are all in temples for the most part. And then we get into the other form of dance that I do, which is this part of this discussion that we're talking about today. And these are court dancers. At some point in Rajasthan, towards the very end of SCA period, there was a shift from temple dancers into court dancers. And a lot of that was because you had a shift in power, and so most of the patronage for dance moved away from the temples and moved into the courts. But there was also something that happened where you had a shift in religion. So the Krishna Bhakti faiths and those traditions started to become more prominent, and the dance practices that nurtured the Devadasi tradition were not the same practices when you got into Vaishnavism and how that functioned in courts. And so you saw a shift from, at least in the Northeast, or Northwest, sometimes also in the Northeast a little bit, but you saw a shift from the temples into the courts. And so you see dancers in courts. You can see them. These are all depictions of dancers in court scenes, births. This one here is Akbar and the dancing girls of Baz Bahadur. Bahadur, yeah, from the Akbarnama. So that's like 1560 through 1610, just about. And you can see that these dances are very different from what you saw before. Well, not very different, but somewhat different. You start seeing more upright posture, more hands in the air. And these are because the Mughals were Timurid Persians. And so they brought traditions from Persia into the Mughal courts. And so women who came into the Mughal courts and became dancers were dancing in the primary dance mode of the Mughal courts, which would have been a very Persian flavored dance. Now, I read an article yesterday last week, I was doing some more deep research on this and trying to figure out how to talk to you guys as an audience about it. And what I found out is that because the Islamic courts and the Mughal courts didn't necessarily have the same vocabulary, which I'm going to give you later on, to understand the stories that the predominantly Hindu dancers were teaching, what we might have seen would have focused more on footwork and technical performance rather than storytelling at the beginning, because that was more what audiences in these courts would have been expected to see. So Kathak is a hard thing to study primarily because it did change so much. Like we don't really know what it looked like. There are people I know who have lots of theories about it, but I haven't been able to find any hard evidence on the continuity between what it looks like now and what it looked like then. But you can see little paintings of people dancing in various ways. And I'm going to post this as a handout so you guys can look at it more closely later if you want. This woman is a very early Mughal painting, and she is very Persian looking. So you can see kind of the continuity between Persian and Mughal. Before I go any farther with that, does anybody have any questions about what I just went over? I know that was kind of a fire hose, and I want to make sure you guys understand what I talked about before I move on. Anybody? Guess I should probably look at the chat. I don't even know how to do that. Okay, well, I didn't hear anybody say anything, so I'm going to keep going. So in the more Hindu dance traditions, there are a number of, so what dancers were doing were using dance as a devotion to a deity. So in the case of Odissi, it would have been Lord Jagannath, who is an incarnation of Vishnu, eventually becomes an incarnation of Vishnu, originally was not. He was a native Orisen god, but then became absorbed into the Vaishnavite tradition. Um, Vishnu has a number of avatars, which are incarnations. The most common that you see in dance is Lord Krishna. And this was because in the roughly the 15th century, there was a thing that arose that was known as a Krishna cult, and the kind of the love between Radha and Krishna, so the longing for union with the sacred and the embodiment of the sacred, that became the main source of devotion for a lot of Hindus in India. And I use Hindu as a blanket term, even though Hinduism is, within Hinduism, there are thousands of separate traditions that vary wildly from one another, but for the sake of, understanding, I'm going to use that. But Krishna and Radha are used very often, and they're used in the way that Sufism uses love poetry to talk about longing for the divine. So it's often, there's a lot of romance to it, there's a lot of emotion. There are these cute love stories, there are these love stories where Radha becomes angry because Krishna has left her and she's just pining for him. So there's a wide range of what can be discussed within this. And in fact, there was a saint poet in the 16th century named Mirabai who wrote a lot of poetry about Krishna that then eventually became used by Muslim singers and Hindu singers and other poets to depict this relationship. But this sort of gripped North India in the 15th century and took hold and became a core part of storytelling. So that's when the story that I'm going to tell today is going to be a Radha Krishna story, because it also has that kind of romance, flirty kind of, the things that we all like to talk about. You also have, there are three main gods in this tradition. They're the Trimurti, which is three. Murti is like a depiction of God. Brahma, who is the creator. Vishnu is the preserver, and he's the one who Krishna is an incarnation of. And Shiva is the destroyer. He's very popular in South India, kind of all over India up until a certain point, and then really very popular in South India. And then there are three goddesses. There are more than three goddesses, but they're generally counterparts to these gods. You have Saraswati, who is the goddess of music and learning. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth. And Parvati is, she is the counterpart to Shiva. And she has three incarnations. One is Parvati, one is Durga, who's the warrior goddess, and then Kali, who is if you want very dramatic change, Kali is your gal. And I could go into those at length, but we'll at least give you things to search on about. The stories are really great. I recommend reading up on them. And so that's kind of an overview of some of the figures you might see in stories. This is sort of a departure from what the dance might have been, which I learned last week before I had a chance to recreate this course. I have since learned that court dance likely didn't look as much like this as I thought. So I will demonstrate some things that I know in dance that are similar to what you might see in a court performance, so more technical aspects, but then I'm really going to dive into storytelling. All right, so then let me see. Do I have chat? Oh, I have something on the chat. Okay, cool. So then there are three things within dance. And these are important when I'm talking about this because there are three expressions of form within Indian classical dance. You have Nritta, which is pure dance, and that's really what I think, based on my research lately, that's what I think you probably would have seen in Mughal courts, would have been more Nritta. So footwork, body movements, turns, that kind of thing. Natya, I've got these two mixed up. Nritya is expression and emotion, so that it's kind of the feelings that you get from dance, but then when you put them together, you create a thing called Natya. And Natya is dramatic performance, Natya Shastra. And so it's the whole thing, the story, the characters, the stage layout, all of that creates Natya. But we're going to focus on that and Nritta today a little bit. There's some people to Google later these people are both they're prominent musicians and also dancers within the Kathak tradition. I think at the end, did I put a link at the end of this? No, I didn't, sorry. The handout that I give later will have some links to YouTube videos to watch and some stuff that you can kind of explore a little more. But for the purposes of this, I didn't need them. And then these things at the bottom here are some very technical terms that you can reference later. Tatkar is footwork, which is probably, in my understanding, is probably the core of what you might have seen in a court. Bowls are like mnemonics. They're words, both in Indian classical music and dance, that you use to represent rhythms, syllables, primarily rhythmic and motion. So when a dancer or a musician hears a particular bowl or sequence of bowls, they know how to perform that piece. A tal, which is a rhythmic structure, can be performed on pretty much any instrument that you want. It's like tal is like, I think tala in Bharatanatyam is the same thing, but it's basically just a sequence of notes. The ones that I'm going to be doing today are in teen tal, which is a 16 beat structure in 4 measures, which is the most close to our kind of 4/4 Western beat structure that I know. So I'm going to go with that. You have rags or raga, and those are melodic structures. If you're familiar with West or Middle Eastern music, maqams are similar, and actually I think I read something recently that rags and maqams are related to one another. So Persian musicians and Persian listeners would have been familiar with rags as a structure because they're similar enough to a maqam or maqamat that you would kind of know what was going on. It wouldn't have sounded alien. And then there are 2 other things. I'm going to be performing a kavat, which is a poem set to a tal, so a poem set to a rhythmic structure, and a gatbhav, which is more of a performance-based version of that, less structured, no words. So, so what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go through 2 of these little performances. First, I'm going to do a kavat, and then I'm going to perform the same thing as a gatbhav, and then we're going to talk about some of the motions and gestures that I used for that. So that's where I'm going to go. Does anybody need any clarification or have any questions about anything that I just went over before I start that? Anybody? Okay. You guys are very patient. Thank you. And we'll have a discussion at the end of this, so you guys can ask a lot of questions, but I just want to make sure that we're all tracking before I start. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quickly. Okay. So, got to adjust my sound real quick so you guys can hear my drum. Oh, I already did that. Okay. It's going to be kind of hard to see me because I'm on a laptop. Can't see my head if I do that. All right, so you just aren't going to be able to see my feet for a second. We'll get back to that. Okay. So the kavat that I'm going to talk about and the gatbhav are a story of Radha and Krishna. And Krishna is a very playful god. Radha is very much in love with him, but she's married. And she wants to be with him, but she understands that it's a little bit problematic. And so a lot of the stories between the 2 of them are when Radha is very much in love with Krishna, but she doesn't want to acknowledge it because it's not socially like the thing you do. But Krishna's very persistent, and he's a bit of a troublemaker, so he likes to tease her. So the story that I'm going to be talking about is Radha going to the Jamuna to get water, and she gets the water and she goes along her way, and Krishna sees her and he's feeling mischievous. He wants her to notice him, so he picks up a stone and he throws it and breaks her pot, which of course gets her all wet, and then she's very angry at him. So it's a very simple story, but something you might have seen performed by someone, because this particular story, and there are some others like it, are I don't know if this exact story is in the Natya Shastra, but there are a number of stories. We have documentation of Radha Krishna performances being done in period. So, and these are performed to just a beat structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my my very period iPhone thing. I don't actually play the tabla, so you're just going to have to go with what I have here. Good to go. All right, good to go. Come on. Just a second. Thank you for your patience. Okay, hopefully everybody can hear that. All right. So I'm gonna say the poem and then I'm gonna perform it and then I'm gonna do the Gaipov. So. Da, din, din, da, din, din, da, din, din, da, din, din, da. Nire, da, barata, jamna, da, par, jaba, bar, nir, utai, da, gar, da, ba, da, gar, jalata, chera, chela, langar, puta, jata, war, futa, jaji, war, mohe, chora, chora, madhav, madhav, madhav. Mohe chora chora madhav madhav madhav. Mohe chora chora madhav madhav madhav. Chida chida langa. Sauji kunwa fusa jaka dagar mohi choda choda mata mata mohi choda choda mata mata mohi choda choda mata mata. Okay, so that was the Kavit, which is a poem. And now I'm going to do a little longer one that is the Gatbah, which is the same story, but a little bit fuller. Okay, so that was the two. And so now I'm going to break them down for you. And the reason I'm doing this, teaching this as a class, is because I did this performance, not this performance, another one in court at a coronation. And part of it was calling friends over and clapping, which in Indian dance, anybody who watches it totally gets what's happening. Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody. But in modern American theater, when you do this, it means everybody should clap. So what happened, it totally threw me off because the whole room started clapping. Oh, thanks everybody. So I figured I should just teach people, what you're seeing. First, before I do that, I'm going to go, well, let me do that really quickly so I can refresh your memory while it's still, you've seen it. And then I'm going to talk about what court dance might actually have looked like, my own theories. So you've got a certain number of things we call mudras, which are hand gestures. And I actually just talked to a friend of mine who's a dancer, and evidently she was talking to a bunch of Malayalam speakers, so like from South India. No, she was not a Malayalam speaker, Malayalam, sorry. And they were able to communicate with one another because they were dancers and they were just using mudras like sign language. So it totally works. So I'll share my screen again because there are some things here. I'm going to go through these mudras. These are pictures of the mudras so you can see them in case you can't see my hands super well. Okay, so this dance uses just a few mudras. The primary one that it uses is Pataka, which is the flag. It's just your hands straight up and down like this. And this is actually, I would say, probably one of the most common mudras that you use in Indian dance. It's your most basic one, and you can use it for all kinds of things. You can use it for rain. You can use it for, to lift the pot on your head. That's part of it. It's just, Lakshmi uses it as part of, giving blessings to people. So that's that one. And so when I did Jamuna, that was Pataka, and the pot was also Pataka. So Radha goes along with her pot and she lifts it off of her head, and she either uses it to lift water out of the stream, or she sets it down and ties a string to it. And the string is Karakamuka, which looks like this. Or you can use Hansasya, which looks like this. Or that's not Hansasya, sorry, I should know the names to these better than I do. Apologies. Don't tell my guru that I don't remember what these are all the time. She would have a fit. Karakamuka, sorry. Karakamuka and Kapita. This is Kapita, and this is Karakamuka. Use Karakamuka to tie things. You can also use Hansasya, which is this, or sorry, that's, get to that in a second. So anyway, you take the pot, you lift it off your head, you tie it up, you lower the string, using Pataka again, into the well, and then using Mushti, which is a fist, you pull it up out of the well, and you pour the water into your pot, put the pot back on your head, and you walk along. Now Krishna has a flute, and generally when you shift positions in these dances, you take a turn so that you can see that you changed subjects. So now you're Krishna, you have a flute, and he sees Radha walking along, puts his flute away, and he gets an idea to be very mischievous. So he picks up a stone, tosses it in his hand, and then he throws it, and then you take a turn, and your Radha and your pot is broken and gotten you all wet. And you have your veil, and you're kind of like, you're mad at him, but you also are very shy and are really glad you saw him anyway. So that's sort of the overall movement of that dance. And these mudras, which I'm going to go through really quickly, are some things you might see when you see a dance like this performed. I didn't use all of them. I used very few. It's been a whole summer since I actually went through them, which is why my memory isn't so great about what they're called. So like I said, please, a little bit of leeway on that. So Pataka is just one hand. Three Pataka is a three-part flag. It can be a crown. It can be a tree. This is an Odissi gesture. This is a tree. It can be an arrow. It can be a lamp. So if you've got a lamp and you've got a wick in your lamp, or you can apply tilak, so like a sectarian mark to your forehead. Ardha Pataka is fold down these two fingers. What did I say? Yeah, there we go. Fold down these two fingers. It's a knife. It can be two, both, so two together, or the banks of a river, if you move them along like this. Kartari Mukha is scissors, obviously. I keep pausing. Sorry about that. Separation of a couple. So if you're broken apart, two different things, corner of an eye. A lot of the time you see this, especially in Bollywood. Mayura is a peacock, which I super love. There was a dance that I did once where you were pushing along like a peacock, but it can also be the beak of a peacock. But a lot of the time, or like if you're Krishna, a lot of the time you'll hold your hand up because he has a peacock feather in his crown. And so in order to be Krishna, you'll show a peacock feather. Ardha Chandra is a half moon. Ardha means half. It can be a waist. It can be the trunk of a tree. It can be touching one's limbs. So if you're talking about, sometimes when you talk about Shiva, you talk about all the ornaments on his limbs. And so you can use it like this. And incidentally, I've actually seen this motion used in Persian classical dance too, where, you know, you're going down your limbs while you dance. Arala is like Mayura, but just with one hand. You drink nectar. A violent wind, you use Arala for that. Shukatunda is a bow or shooting an arrow. So it's these two fingers folded down. This one's a little tricky. Mushti is a fist. Can be grasping something. Like I was just using steadfastness, you know, so if you're a god and you're steadfast and strong, or if you're in a violent mood, like you want to punch somebody, totally used for that. Shikara is a bell or a Shiva lingam. So you can, there's a two-handed gesture that is a Shiva lingam. This is the lingam, so it's basically a phallus, but it's a stone that's used to represent Shiva. Or sometimes you use it on your head to show his top knot. Kapita, we already went over. This is, you can do it like this, or with your fingers out. It can be a parrot a lot of the time. There's a dance that I know where you put your arm out and then you have a bird sitting on a branch. So that's the little bird. It can be Lakshmi. So Lakshmi holds a lotus in her hand. I think it's the left hand, yeah. And then she holds the other down, giving blessing, but she has the lotus, so you're holding the lotus up. Sarasvati sometimes, if you're talking about playing an ornament, or an instrument, sorry, holding a flower like the lotus, and cymbals, so if you're playing hand cymbals. Karikamukha is plucking flowers, so plucking from a tree. And I've actually used this one in Persian classical dance too, where there's a little overlap. Holding a necklace to put it on, talking, or it can be Krishna's flute. Suchi can mean one. It can be Vishnu's chakra. So like if you guys have seen Xena Warrior Princess, that thing that she has on her belt is actually an ancient weapon called a chakra. And Vishnu holds one on his finger that it represents the world or the universe. It could be the sun, or an umbrella. Chandrakala is the new moon or the crescent moon, and it's like this, but I usually see it performed out like a kind of a weird gun shape. But it can also be the crescent moon in Shiva's crown. You can use it to represent a face, so if you bring it around your face. Padma Kosha is an opening lotus, so there's a closed lotus, but Padma Kosha, generally, it's like slightly open. Sarpashirsha is a serpent. Mrigashirsha is a deer or Krishna's flute. You can also hold a pot with Sarpashirsha if it's very curved. Simhamukha is a lion's head, fire sacrifice, or a lotus garland. I have never been able to figure out what the difference between a lotus garland and a flower garland and a jasmine garland looks like in practice, but I'm sure they're different. Kangala is a bell, so you take your ring finger and you kind of, and I encourage you guys to try these out if you're watching. They're kind of fun. Kangala, you take your ring finger and you curl it in, and then you close all the rest of your fingers, and it can be a betel nut, which is like a nut people chew in India. A bell, if you want to ring a bell. A coconut, because it looks like a new coconut with the little, it's round with a little tuft on it. Or a white lily. Again, I don't know how you would do that. The flowers confound me. Ala Padma is something that you see a lot in Indian dance, like especially in Bollywood. You'll see people, you know, make big wide gestures with Ala Padma, but you basically just fan all your hands out, and it's a fully blooming lotus. So like if you have a bud, you have a slightly open lotus, so Mukula is a bud. Padma Kosha is the slightly opening lotus, and then Ala Padma would be the fully opened lotus. You can also use it to ask a question like, what are you doing? You know, or the face of your beloved. Like, it's so beautiful. The full moon, you can talk about that up above you. Chatura is this. So if you take your pinky finger up, you fold your fingers down over your thumb, breaking into pieces, your eyes, what else? Dampness, I guess, like damp. Brahmara, I love this one. This is a bee. Kind of curl your ring finger or your first finger up, and you close it like this. The other two fingers out, and you can usually buzz it around. It's also a bird, and if you use two of them together and you kind of open your fingers, that's a demon. That's a two-handed gesture. I love this one. Hansasya is like tying a thread or a single pearl, lighting a lamp, or drawing a picture, or jasmine flowers because they're very small. Hansapaksha is a swan's wing or building a bridge. Mukula, eating your navel or a lotus bud. Tamarchuda is a bird's head, could be a crow or an engraving tool. And then Trishul is often used in when you talk about Shiva because he holds a trident. So Trishul is 3, or it is Shiva's trident, or it can be used to represent the Trimurti that we talked about earlier. Any questions about that? Anybody? Oh, I got some more chats. Let's see, make sure there's no questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing again. And like I said, I will send out a handout. So if you didn't see that and you need to look at it more closely, there'll be one that has like a video of people doing those so you can remember how they're made. And the reason I like to talk about those is that I know that a lot of people do dance, and sometimes you want to be very descriptive. And I find that there are a lot of really cute gestures that you can use to be kind of coy with people, you know, to sort of like, they're just very neat. One of the things I will say is that there's a type of dancing in India that gets conflated with Nautch girls. It's called mudra dancing, M-U-J-R-A, and a lot of the time when you do start to see really solid depictions of courtesans in Indian classical dance, you see mudra women. These women, as far as I know, are very post-period. And so what that system didn't get codified, or Tawaif, T-A-W-A-I-F, that's another word that you see. I so far have not found historical or SCA period references to those women. Again, does not mean that they don't exist, but I think that dance, like court dancers, were dedicated to particular courts in the same way that they were dedicated to particular temples. They were very well educated. They came from a tradition where they were studying all the time. They knew very much about all of the stories that they were showing, musical performance. Whether or not they also performed sex work, I don't know. So that's really my caveat for that. How much time do I have? Okay, so I'm going to do a little brief overview of the more technical types of dance and kind of talk a little bit about Persian dance, just to touch on it because that's what I'm dressed as right now. And then I'm going to open it up and let you guys ask questions because we'll start there. But first I'm going to go over this. So in core, like the core parts of both Kathak and Odissi, you have very rhythmic, technical dance performance. And as far as I can understand, that's probably what you saw more in courts than kind of the things that I just performed right now, although there might have been a little bit of it. So when you heard me do ta te 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 a te te ta or da tin din da da tin din da, those are bowls, and they represent footwork. And so I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see my feet. Yeah, looks like you can. So this is Teen Thal, and so it's right, left, right, left, left, right, left, right, right, left, right, left, left, right, left, right. And that is sort of the core and basis of everything that I personally do in Kathak. Odissi also has footfalls. I think that's really common for a lot of Indian classical dances, and as far as I can tell also dates back to historical practice in that you had ankle bells that people wore. We have a lot of descriptions of women wearing ankle bells while they danced. We have a lot of descriptions of women creating sounds with their feet. And when the reason that a dancer would have known music at the same time is that your feet and those bells essentially become an accompaniment for musicians. And so within a court scenario, like those miniatures that I showed you guys at the beginning, your dancers were actual musical performers as well. And so the whole ecosystem of that musical performance becomes the dancers' feet, the bells ringing, all the musicians and the music that they're singing, and then the movements of the dancer. Sometimes you even see dancers with things that look like, these are modern cartel, which are actually not at all period. They date from about 1980. But there were rhythmic hands, like basically sounds, they look like little castanets, but they're long, that you see dancers holding. So they were an integral part of music performance in courts. And most of the time when you see a big celebration in a court, you see the king, you see all of his courtiers, who are usually men, and then in the center there are a number of dancers and female musicians. So there was this sort of ecosystem of female performers within the court, but only as dancers. The women in the one with the drums that I showed you that was the Akbari miniature, they're spinning. So clearly there was some spinning that happened. So you have this kind of spin. They were doing one that looked more like with their hands above their head. It looked like some of them were spinning with drums. Your typical Kathak spin is very fast and with your hands out, but that's kind of the thing that Kathak is, that I think it probably always was, at least from the Mughal period onwards, because Persian dance also has a lot of turns and spins in it. And in fact, there's a two-step spin that starts to make like a decagon, or like a shape on the ground that looks a lot like a Persian spin. So that's kind of my own personal theory. I'm continuing to do research on what that looked like, but again, it's very tough because dance is a hard thing to research in general. And then each separate piece of footwork has its own footwork pattern. So like when you shift to 7 beats, that changes. So you have, so that's 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Or you have 10 beats, which is Japtal. Whatever that rhythm structure is, you also accompany it. I don't think there's anything else. There's a whole bunch of really crazy rhythms. You can start breaking them down. They become very fast. They all have different names. At some point, there's a thing called a tumri. That's a cyclical thing that becomes a core part of Kathak dance. And there is also, the name of that has completely escaped me right now. There's another dance form that became popular in the 16th century that was basically based on poetry. And you can see it a lot. Qawwali singers, which are Muslim, like traditional Muslim Hindustani singers, often perform, not tukra, not tumri. It'll come to me later. They perform these as musical performances, but also there's a dance performance, and that was codified within the courts because you would have somebody repeating the same phrase over and over and over again. And it was up to the dancer to perform that phrase differently every single time to retain the attention of the court. And it's said that the greatest dancers could keep a court's attention for 20, 30 minutes with the same line of text, sung by the musician. So, and apparently they were very perfumed. That's something else I've learned. I went to a performance with an Odissi dancer, and she does a lot of historical research. Her name is Vijayini Satpathy. And she, when she went on stage, you could smell sandalwood in the entire audience, and it was so magical. When I asked her about it, she said, yeah, I found like a reference to this in a text, and she said, I thought I would try it because it creates a very different experience of me as a dancer if you get kind of all of the senses. And so I did. I read some on it, and this was a thing. And I like to perfume myself so that when I enter a room, it's like physical presence as well as, you know, what I'm doing as a performer. So I think it's a really interesting subject, and I would encourage anybody who's curious about it to go and research more on Indian dance performance, because I'd love to see what other people come up with. So that's the end of my spiel. I'm opening it to questions, Q&A. Does anybody have any questions? I'm not sure how we've been doing this, but
Well, when you said that you found some of the same hand movements in Persian as well as in Indian,
yes,
um,
Kathak specifically. Just want to say that. Yeah.
okay. I have heard that Persian dance was basically lost because some of the Shahs were very strict, and that much of the Persian dance we have today was reconstructed in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I just wonder if they were borrowing from the Indian dance.
You know, it's entirely possible. I hadn't heard that, but that is interesting. I'd love to read more about it. I think that I don't know, that's a really interesting theory, because I feel like the same thing has happened with Indian dance, with the exception of Kathak. Kathak is it's a funny thing because it has had a kind of a court patronage for a very long time, and then when the British came into power, they were also paying women as nautch dancers to come and dance for them. And while the nature of the dancers in relation to their patronage changed a bit, like I think they became more like prostitution became a very heavily practiced within the nautch community, just because that's just because of the stigma that was put on dance by the British, and I think even the Brahmin elite at the time. But the dance form was kind of like, there was more of a continuity there than maybe some other dances. But I would be really curious to know, because there are a lot of similarities between what I've seen people practice as far as Persian dance goes and Indian classical dance, specifically Kathak.
I was going to say that one of the reasons for that might be the Muslim kingdoms that
Yeah,
were
well,
in India.
most of the major schools of Kathak are also Muslim kingdoms. So Jaipur, which have been the Mughals, Lucknow and Benares were also Mughal seats. A lot of the terms are Persian terms, because Persian would have been the core language at the time. So that's a good thing. I'm gonna have to do some more research into that, because I hadn't really thought about it. But thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it. And then I think Angelina, whose SCA name I always forget, but hello again. That was Bijayani Satpati. I will type her name in the chat because it's hard. She's amazing. If you don't follow her on Instagram, please do. She is one of the two, so she and Sarupa Sen were the two principal choreographers and I think just directors of Nrityagram, and which is that amazing school in Odisha that like anybody goes to learn, like they're so incredible. But she's actually split off from Nrityagram now, and she's doing her own thing, and she's got an amazing Instagram. I actually think everybody on this chat should go find it and follow it, because she does all these really cool, like she's doing all this movement research based on stuff that's listed in the Natya Shastra. So she's doing a lot of recreation of stuff that looks like core essential movement things from the Natya Shastra that she's demonstrating on her Instagram. And it's so neat. She also writes a bunch of scholarly papers about it too. So she's a really good person to follow for dance in general, but hers is more Odissi focused, which I love Odissi anyway, so I think it's cool. So.
I have a question about footwork.
Yes.
Does it ever is it ever part of the storytelling? I mean, when you do certain footwork, does it change the meaning of the handwork? Is it ever used part of
not really. It's usually,
or is it just more of a rhythmic thing?
So,
is it part of keeping your rhythm, or does it ever affect the story that you're trying to tell?
So yes and no. It doesn't ever tell part of the story, if that makes sense. So like your hand gestures are really what you're using to, and your Like, so it's a whole package kind of thing. You have
Okay.
body movements, and there are 3 kinds of body movements. You have your core movements, you have your large limb movements, and then you have your small limb movements. You have your face and your head and your neck. That's part of it. Your eyes are a huge part of it, especially if you're a practitioner of Bharatanatyam. You know this because like you spend as much time practicing eye movements as you do anything else.
Right.
It's very different depending on the tradition. But the feet then become what move you around the stage. They often set the pace of the dance. So like sometimes in Odissi, the pace of the dance changes depending on, you know, is it a fast part or a slow part, and the feet help set that. And they also, this is sort of like, generally pacing is the thing that the feet determine more than anything else, because you can set a very specific rhythm with them. So
Right.
in Odissi, right, you have like slow movements, and then there are some fast parts that speed it up. Usually when you're fighting or you have something that's very energetic, you'll have very, very energetic foot movements.
Okay.
And also in Kathak, you start out very slow, and then the performance becomes faster and faster and faster towards the end, and your footwork increases speed. So people in the audience can understand that your performance is speeding up.
The intensity.
Exactly. So it doesn't exactly tell the story, but it influences the whole kind of experience of what you're doing.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Welcome. You guys have good questions. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
What got you interested in Indian dance?
So when I was growing up, we had some really good family friends who were from India, and the daughters who I was friends with performed. I don't even know what it was at this point. Like, it was so long ago. I think it was Kathak, but who knows? They performed in a talent show, and like I've always been like, we've always had family friends who were Indian, so that's just sort of been part of my life. And I, you know, over the course of time just kept like getting into it, being really interested in it. And finally, I guess it's about 6 or 7 years ago, I went to a mela, which is a festival for Diwali, which is like the big festival of lights and of year kind of thing in the Hindu calendar. And there was a dance performance, and there were a bunch of adults. And so I went to the school, and there was a lady who was not Indian who was performing with them. So I went to her and I said, "How do I do this?" And I finally just bit the bullet and went ahead and did it. But it's always been, I love watching dances in movies, and I love watching them on YouTube, and it was just something I, you know, like ever since I was a kid and I saw that for the first time, I was like, I want to do that. That's so pretty. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then I have a friend who does Odissi, and I never thought I wanted to do that, and then I started doing it. I'm like, I actually really like this, so I'm doing that too. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of how I got to it, sort of roundabout.
A little, not directly related to your dance performance, which was wonderful, and I think I learned a lot, and I hope other people did too.
So,
But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your garb, and do you have patterns up anywhere, especially for the hat?
okay, so I don't have hat patterns up, but I can put some up. Sorry, I'm gonna sit down for this part. I tweaked my back, so I'm gonna sit and talk to you guys. So if you give me just a second, I'm gonna get myself into this chair that I've made very tall. Hang on, this is gonna be a little bit of a ride for a second here. All right. There you go. Okay, so my garb is what I call a peshwaz, and I'll step back for a second so you can see more of it. It's really hard on this computer screen because it's only so tall, but it's like this fitted garment. So it has an upper bodice that closes in the front here. I have a little bit open right now. Generally has long sleeves, though it can have short sleeves. The dancer's version that I've seen mostly is long, so this is kind of floor length, and I have on shalwar underneath, which you also see dancers wearing. Sometimes they have a layer on over the top. This is sort of, from what I can tell, dancers are like the fanciest people in court. So they're like it's like a very flashy version of what you see other people in court. So this is like a typical woman's outfit for the Mughal courts, but like the most extra version of it that you can imagine. Like, you know, like any stage costume really is. And then they have these tall hats, the name of which I don't know really. There's a woman who's done some research on this, and she has a name for them, but we haven't really found a definitive name for them, so I just call it a Mughal hat. But it's essentially a hennin, so it's like a cone. Sometimes they're open, like this one's a little open in the back. It has a horse hair tuft on it, and they're either closed by themselves without this veil, or usually in the dancers you see them with a scarf like this. And I know why, because they don't stay on your head unless you tie them off with a scarf. If you're just kind of hanging out, you can wear them without one. Also, usually the dancers, you'll see them without this veil under the hat. This is more of a kind of a court lady way to wear this, but again, I can't keep the veil on me while I dance, so I stick it under my hat. So I put that there, and this, very often, I think it's interesting that the Courtesans Guild has a red veil, because dancers, a lot of the time you see them in red. The court ladies will be in white. I don't know. It's weird. And then sometimes they have like a short sleeve coat over the top. But I, like I said, I don't have a pattern for this, but I could probably put one together. This is sort of an experimental construction. I've only made a few of these because I've been testing them out with different people's heads. But it's based off of a Taj pattern that Mistress Judy of Meridier's used to be Outlands and Aidenvelt put together, and it's based on her construction. It's like a plastic, that like needlepoint grid stuff, because it's very weather resistant, and then it's covered with felt and fabric, and then it has a tie in the back. Like there's this little tie that ties it in a knot. I'll turn around in the back. See it. And then I've taken this scarf that I block printed and I tied it around the outside. And then there's earrings, lots and lots and lots of pearls. I have anklets on my feet, but not heavy ankle bells, because I haven't really seen heavy ankle bells in Mughal dancers' drawings. Lots of bangles. Sometimes I wear a huge ring. Didn't want to bother with it today. And sometimes a big old nose ring. So. But yes, I have a pattern for the Peshwas that I can send out. Because I taught a class on that at Meridier's, the Royal University of Meridier's, I guess, last month. But I don't have a pattern for the hat yet. But I can put one. Bless you.
Not new.
Anybody else? Does that answer your question? I hope it answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Good. I have a blog on Facebook, and I can post, I'll post all my handouts there. I think there's probably a way to do it in the group, and I'll post them up there too, just so you guys have multiple places to go find them. So I think it's really fun. This is like a huge rabbit hole you could fall down, and I'm super interested in, you know, hearing about how other people, you know, just like if you do research in Indian classical dance and period, I'm just curious about what you found and what kind of dance you do. And, you know, because I think that there are relatively few of us researching it, and be kind of cool to pool resources a little bit and see what people have dug up.
I don't do dance specifically, but I kind of have at various points researched quite a bit about like Mughal court life and things like that.
Okay. Are you the person who made the hats, like the whole outfit?
No, that was somebody else.
Oh, somebody else. Okay.
No, but mostly looking at the Mughal court kind of to get clues about what was going on in the Deccan at around the same time.
You should talk to Mistress Meenakshi. She knows a lot about that.
I've talked to Meenakshi many times.
Good.
But anyway, about, you know, kind of looking at what's going on sort of in like South Central India. And I just wanted to throw out there just to give people an idea of kind of what people like Margavati are up against when they're trying to do this research. The Baburnama, which is the first Mughal emperor of India's autobiography. And he has like all kinds of details about all kinds of stuff. And one of the things in there, like towards the very end, he's describing this like big court entertainment. And he spends like, honest to God, like a page talking about all the stuff the acrobats did.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you were like an acrobat, you could probably put together a really solid reconstruction of a 16th century Indian like tumbling performance based on what Babur wrote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after he's described all of this in lavish and loving detail, then he gets to the end, he said, and then some dancers showed up and they danced. And it's like, we must restrain the fist of death.
Yeah, because it's probable, like that was so early on before like any of that stuff really got influenced heavily by the Mughals, although there was some influence at that point because you got a little bit of cross-cultural stuff. It would have been really nice to know what that looked like, because that, I have a feeling, was way different than, what we think of as Kathak. My theory is that Kathak is very modern, or at least relatively modern as far as, it looks more Mughal than it does like traditionally Indian, based on all the other classical dances in India and how it differs from them. But that's just my own personal theory. And I have arguments about this with my teacher because she's just like, no, it's totally historical. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but yeah. So.
Or it's possible they were Timurid Persian dancers and he didn't need to describe them because everybody knows what they look like.
It could be, yeah. Like they just brought in their own dancers for it. And I like the document that I read.
Yeah, except that he also describes a whole bunch of Timurid Persian stuff in great and loving detail if he's into it. Like I mean, he has this whole thing where he's like talking about like all the different kinds of fruit.
Yeah.
And I mean, he talks about stuff that he's interested in.
Well, and I also wonder, since he had somebody, like, he wasn't actually writing it himself, he dictated it through like a guy who wrote it for him. I'm also like wondering, if he was like, describe the court, and the guy didn't actually see any of that stuff, like he knew what happened but didn't witness it,
Yeah,
it got lost in translation there.
Yeah, I'm clinging to the Babur was just trying to annoy future dancers theory.
Well, there are two extant Persian cookbooks, both from the 16th century, and some of the recipes say, and here's the recipe for such and such, but I don't need to tell you about it because everybody knows how to bake it.
Yeah, and maybe dance was, either he wasn't interested or it was just so commonplace that it was like, I don't need to talk about that. You guys know what happens. Like, this is at every party. Why do I need to talk about it?
Yeah, but, I mean, Babur explains a lot of stuff. Like he explains that you don't drink at a marijuana party, which is good to know.
And that would matter because he drank too much most of the time.
And also ate a whole bunch of weed
and opium.
Yeah, and opium.
He liked opium. Yeah. So I don't know. I would love to know. This is like, there are two things I want a time machine for. One of them is for the garment known as a patka, which is like this white piece of fabric that's in front of the skirt on Mewari Hindu women's garments. I have zero idea what it is. I mean, I have an educated guess, but I don't really know what it is. And the other one is, I want to see people dancing. Like, I want to know what it looks like, but I don't have a time machine, so we just have to figure it out. But it's good to know that there are other dancers, like full-time dancers in India, researching this stuff too. So that's, I think, a very heartening thing to know when you go into this, that you're not alone. And much of what we see in Indian dance performance is reconstructed. Like Urtatim said, that, that the similarly with Persian dance, that you're having to go from the sources you do have and recreate it to the best of your ability. And that's kind of the practice, you know. I mean, there were so few Devadasis left in India after the British imperial period that, you know, there wasn't a lot of continuity of tradition to go on when some of these dances were recreated. So Odissi in particular is very new because it's both the oldest dance and that it's the oldest documented in sculpture, and also one of the newest ones in that it was recreated more recently than a lot of the others. And there's a great dissertation I read on the difference between Mahari dance, which is temple dance, and Gotipua dance, which is what modern Odissi was recreated from through Kelucharan Mohapatra, who is like the guru of Odissi, modern Odissi dance, and how those two differed in period and when the Gotipuas came up and their relation to Tantra and Vaishnavism. It's a very cool dissertation, but it gave me a totally different picture of the dance form that I'm doing in relation to period dance. You just learns new stuff all the time. So, anywho, anybody else have any more questions? It was really great to teach all of you. I'm so glad you were here. Thanks for listening and learning. I hope this got you at least inspired to go and find some dance videos.
Thanks for the class.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you. I can post a link to the dissertation. Yeah, I'll post that up on my, you know what, I'll just, I do not know the best way. What is the best way for me to post stuff for this later?
You can post links to the event page.
Okay, I can do that. And I'll post the link to the dissertation, the links to my Peshawaz garb stuff, because I haven't made the hat one yet, and the link to my blog, which is where everything else will be. I'll post, and the handout for this class. I'll post all that in the event page, and then you guys will have it.
One of the things I want to thank.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. One of the things, can you hear me?
Yes.
One of the things that I want to thank you for, and all of the people, I know we're stuck, we're isolated. We can't get out, but considering how wide the known world is, considering how many kingdoms there are, considering how unlikely we are to get together different kingdoms like Australia and New York. So things like this help cross-pollinate all over the unknown world.
Definitely. It's been nice to teach people outside of Meridians because my audience is relatively small. I mean, it's as small as it can be in a kingdom.
Where is Meridians?
It's the southeast, so Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, little parts of Kentucky, the panhandle of Florida. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not smaller than any other kingdom. It's just, you've got a limited audience. So this gives me more people to talk to. So thank you guys.
And more people who may be interested in your research.
Yes. Yes. My goal is that someday I stop wearing Indian garb because there are enough actual Indian people in the SCA who do it that I don't have to anymore. But up until then, I want to get people interested and educated and hopefully with a broader understanding of what the world looked like in period than we've had historically. So yeah, thanks for being interested. That's the first step.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. If there's no more questions, I will end the meeting.
Well, thank you so much, Margavati. It was beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye, everyone.